In the far north of Sweden, inside a factory the size of a small city, there is a number that should not be possible. On its worst morning, this company had about $30 million left in the bank. That sounds like a lot of money until you know the rest. To build this place, it had raised roughly $15 billion. $15 billion and $30 million left, about 1 week of breathing room. This is the story of how Europe's boldest industrial bet ran out of air, and how a single cancelled order started a countdown that no amount of money, ambition, or goodwill could stop. The company was called Northvolt. To understand why its fall shook an entire continent, you first have to understand the promise it was built on. For years, one uncomfortable fact had haunted European industry. The continent that invented the modern automobile could no longer make the single most important part of the modern automobile, the battery. Almost every lithium-ion cell in the world came from Asia, from a handful of giants in China, South Korea, and Japan. Europe designed beautiful cars and then bought their beating hearts from someone else. In the middle of the 2010s, two former Tesla executives, Peter Carlson and Paolo Cerruti, decided that was unacceptable. They had helped Tesla build its supply chain. They had seen how batteries were really made. And they believed Europe could build its own. Their pitch was simple, and it was enormous. Build a European battery champion from nothing. Make the cleanest, greenest cells on Earth in Sweden, powered by Nordic hydroelectric energy, and hand Europe back its independence. This was not framed as just another startup chasing a profit. It was framed as a mission, almost a patriotic one. Politicians loved it, investors loved it, the public loved it. Because Northvolt was not really selling batteries, it was selling a feeling that the West could still build hard, physical things, that it had not forgotten how to make the future with its own hands. And when a company sells a feeling that powerful, the money does not just arrive, it floods in. They chose a town called Skellefteå, near the edge of the Arctic Circle, cold, remote, and rich in clean hydroelectric power. And there, in the snow, they began to build something staggering. A gigafactory, that word is not marketing. It means a factory whose output is measured in gigawatt hours. The plan for the flagship site, called Northvolt ET, was for around 60 gigawatt hours of annual capacity. Enough battery cells for hundreds of thousands of electric cars every single year. Cranes climbed out of the frozen ground. Thousands of workers arrived from more than 100 countries, and by late 2021, the first battery cell designed and assembled in that Swedish factory rolled off the line. For one shining moment, the mission looked completely real. Europe was building its own future, and Northvolt was the proof standing in the snow. Money followed the vision, and it followed fast. Northvolt became the best-funded startup Europe had ever produced, raising roughly $15 billion in equity and debt across its lifetime. And look at who wrote the checks. Volkswagen took a stake of around 20%. Goldman Sachs became a major shareholder. Pension funds, the European Investment Bank, BMW, and a long line of carmakers all put their money in. The order book was just as extraordinary on paper. Northvolt was sitting on tens of billions of dollars in future contracts from the biggest names in the automotive world. Every signal the market could send said the same thing. This was not a gamble. This was the safest bet in European industry, and that belief that near total certainty is exactly what made the next part so difficult for anyone to see coming. To see why so many clever people believed, you have to see the race Northvolt was running in. On the other side stood the giants of Asia. Companies like CATL of China and LG of South Korea that already produced most of the world's battery cells at a scale and a cost Europe could only dream of. Every electric car Europe wanted to build depended on them. For politicians, that dependence was a nightmare. It meant the future of the continent's single most important industry, the automobile, was being quietly handed to factories on the other side of the world. Northvolt was the answer to that fear. If it succeeded, Europe would have its own supply, its own jobs, and its own control. If it failed, there was no obvious plan B. That is why the money and the hope poured in with so little hesitation. The stakes were never only commercial. They were national. Here is the thing the pitch decks never quite captured. Building a battery factory and building a battery are two completely different problems. Anyone with enough money can pour concrete, raise steel, and install rows of gleaming machines. But making lithium-ion cells at massive scale is one of the hardest manufacturing challenges on the planet. Every cell has to be almost perfectly identical, chemically pure, consistent, safe. Produced not by the thousand, but by the millions with almost no defects, in rooms so dry and so clean that a trace of moisture can ruin an entire batch. Get the process even slightly wrong, and your yield collapses. And when your yield collapses, you are no longer shipping batteries. You are shipping expensive scrap at a staggering loss, while the whole factory keeps burning money around you. The Asian giants Northvolt wanted to challenge had spent decades learning this the hard way, quietly one failure at a time. Northvolt was trying to compress that entire education into just a few short years, and instead of narrowing its focus to master that one brutal problem, it did the opposite. It expanded on almost every front at once, new factories planned in Germany and in Canada. Ventures into energy storage, into raw materials, into battery recycling, a workforce that swelled towards 6,500 people. It was building an empire before it had reliably built a single high-volume production line. Every one of those fronts demanded cash, attention, and expertise, and all three were finite. The factory was rising far faster than the know-how inside it. And in manufacturing, that gap is exactly where companies go to die. In manufacturing, there is a specific word for the moment a factory goes from making a handful of things to making millions of them: the ramp. And Northvolt's ramp simply would not ramp. Behind the gleaming press releases, the reality on the factory floor was grinding and slow. Production volumes stayed far below target month after month. Reported output was a tiny fraction of the capacity the factory had been designed for. A later Swedish investigation suggested that only a limited quantity of finished cells was actually being sold, and that some of what did ship leaned on materials bought in from other companies, rather than the fully homegrown battery the branding had promised. None of this was necessarily fraud. It was something more ordinary, and in some ways more dangerous. A company burning through billions of dollars to run a factory that could not yet reliably deliver the one thing it existed to make. And every stumble on that factory floor came with a price tag. When a batch of cells failed its quality checks, that was not a rounding error. It was expensive raw material, expensive energy, and expensive hours, all turned into waste. Multiply that by the scale Northvolt was attempting, and the losses became staggering. The company was effectively paying over and over again for the privilege of learning how to do the one thing it had told investors it already knew how to do. And meanwhile, the clock on all that borrowed money never stopped. Interest does not pause while you fix your process. Suppliers still expect to be paid. Salaries still come due every month. This is the cruel arithmetic of hardware. In software, a failed version costs you a little time. In manufacturing, a failed version costs you a warehouse full of money. And month after month, Northvolt kept filling warehouses. For a while, the customers were patient. They wanted Northvolt to succeed almost as badly as Northvolt did. And then one of them stopped waiting. In June of 2024, the German carmaker BMW walked away from a battery cell contract worth around 2 billion euros, roughly $2.2 billion. The reason it gave was blunt. Northvolt was reportedly about 2 years behind on ramping up production, and BMW could not build its cars around a supplier that could not deliver on time. Read that number again. 2 billion euros, gone in a single decision. For a company already bleeding cash, this was not just a lost sale, it was a signal broadcast to every other customer and investor who was watching. If BMW had lost faith, why should anyone else keep theirs? Industry analysts would later mark that one cancellation as the moment the countdown truly began. From that point on, the math turned merciless. A gigafactory does not sit quietly and idle cheaply. Even running far below capacity, Northvolt was spending enormous sums every single month on staff, on energy, on materials, and on the endless, desperate work of trying to fix the process. Money was flowing out far faster than product was flowing to customers. In September of 2024, the cuts arrived. Northvolt announced it would eliminate around 1,600 jobs, a large share of them in the very heartland of the project in Sweden. Layoffs are supposed to buy a company time, but when your core problem is a factory that cannot yet produce, cutting the people around it does not fix the machine. It only tells the entire world just how close to the edge you already are, and the edge was rushing toward them. It is worth pausing on what this meant for one small place. Skellefteå was a quiet northern town of a few tens of thousands of people. Northvolt promised to transform it. Thousands of new jobs, new housing, new schools, new restaurants, families arriving from all over the world to build the future in the snow. A whole community reshaped itself around the factory and the belief that it could not fail. So when the layoffs came and then the bankruptcy, the damage was not just measured in billions of dollars on a balance sheet in Stockholm. It was measured in half-empty apartment blocks, cancelled plans, and people who had moved their entire lives to the edge of the Arctic for a job that no longer existed. This is what a $15 billion failure actually looks like from the ground. Not just a number. A town holding its breath. By the autumn of 2024, the grand mission had quietly become a rescue operation. Northvolt's leaders went looking for a lifeline. They talked to existing investors, to carmakers, to banks, to anyone who might bridge the gap while the factory was fixed, but the story had flipped. The same aura of certainty that once pulled billions in now worked violently in reverse. Every potential savior asked the same devastating question. If $15 billion could not make this company work, what exactly would another billion buy? Confidence, once it truly cracks, is almost impossible to rebuild. The rescue talks dragged on, the cash kept draining, and the company that had never once struggled to raise money suddenly could not raise enough of it fast enough to save its own life. On the 21st of November 2024, the first domino fell in public. Northvolt filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States. The filings laid the crisis completely bare, around $5.8 billion in debt. And in cash, only about $30 million. For a company of this scale, $30 million is almost nothing. Roughly 1 week of operations. The entire point of Chapter 11 is to keep the lights on while a company hunts for a buyer or restructures its debt, and a small amount of emergency financing was scraped together just to keep it breathing. But make no mistake about what that filing meant. Europe's battery champion, the company that had been called the safest bet in European industry, was now formally insolvent and living week to week. For a few months, hope still flickered. Chapter 11 is not the end. Companies do emerge from it, leaner and alive. The trustees and the leadership kept searching for a rescuer with pockets deep enough and patience long enough to wait out the ramp. But the fundamental problem never changed. The factory still could not reliably produce at the scale the numbers demanded, and no serious rescuer was buying a spreadsheet. They would be buying a promise that Northvolt could finally do the one hard thing it had always struggled to do. Month after month, that rescuer never appeared. So the end came in the spring. On March 12th of 2025, Northvolt filed for bankruptcy in Sweden itself. Not restructuring, not rescue, bankruptcy. A court-appointed trustee took control to sell off the assets and settle whatever could still be settled. Commentators reached for the same phrase again and again. The largest bankruptcy in modern Swedish industrial history. So this is the autopsy. Why did Northvolt really die? It is tempting to blame the obvious suspects. Maybe electric cars were failing, but that is far too easy. Demand growth slowed? Yes. But the world kept buying more electric vehicles and Asian battery makers kept selling them by the millions. Maybe then it was a scam. But the evidence does not support that either. Northvolt built real factories and shipped real cells. The truth is quieter and far more useful. Northvolt scaled the factory faster than it could scale the cell. It raised and spent money like a company that had already conquered battery manufacturing, building enormous capacity on many fronts at once, before it had truly mastered the single difficult process that all of that capacity depended on. There is an uncomfortable lesson buried in this wreckage, and it reaches far beyond one Swedish company. For decades, the West told itself a comforting story, that the hard, dirty work of manufacturing could safely be left to other countries, while it kept the clever, profitable parts for itself. The design, the software, the brand. Northvolt was a bet that this story could be reversed. That the West could learn to make the hard things again quickly at massive scale, from a standing start. Its collapse does not prove that this is impossible, but it proves that it is far harder than any pitch deck will admit. Decades of hard-won manufacturing knowledge cannot simply be bought in a single funding round. It has to be earned slowly, on a real factory floor through thousands of small and costly failures. Money can begin that process. What Northvolt proved is that money alone cannot skip it. One lost contract exposed that gap. Collapsing confidence poured into the gap. And in the end, the cash simply ran out through it. Northvolt did not die of bad luck. It died of sequence. And the cost was never only financial. Volkswagen and Goldman Sachs saw their stakes in the company largely wiped out. Thousands of skilled workers lost their jobs in a small northern town that had reshaped itself around the dream. Pieces of Northvolt were eventually picked up by other companies hunting for cheap factories and hard-won expertise. But the deepest loss was strategic. Northvolt had been Europe's clearest answer to an urgent question. Can the West still build the hard, physical things that power the modern world? For a few bright years, it had been living proof that the answer was yes. Its collapse turned that proof into a warning. $15 billion, a gigafactory at the edge of the Arctic, the backing of an entire continent, and in the end about $30 million and 1 week of air. Northvolt was not brought down by a villain, or a fraud, or a sudden disaster. It was brought down by the distance between a promise and a production line. Money and ambition were never going to be enough. Somebody still had to make the thing work, on the floor. One cell at a time. Every fortune leaves evidence. This one left a silent gigafactory in the snow, still waiting for the future it was built to make. If this kind of forensic business autopsy is what you came here for, like this video, subscribe, and we will open the next case file together. This has been Case File 3, Northvolt.